Okay, guys, today we're talking about infancy, but we're not talking about all of infancy. This time we're going to focus specifically on the physical development in infants and the cognitive development in infants. So this lecture is going to be applicable whether you are using the Development Across the Lifespan, 8th edition by Feldman, or the Discovering the Lifespan, 4th edition, also by Feldman. All right, let's talk about physical development first. As you've probably noticed, but didn't really realize you noticed, the way an infant grows, the body parts are not at the same proportion that they are in adults. So if you look at this graph on the right-hand side, you'll see that an infant's head is much bigger in proportion to the rest of its body. All parts of the infant are not growing at the same rate. Their head is disproportionately large. It's 1/4 of their full body length as an infant. But by the time they get to be an adult, you can see that it's actually their head is 1/8 of their entire body length. And if you kind of think about what if a baby were born with the same proportions as an adult human? What if their head was 1/8 of their body instead of 1/4? They would look rather strange and maybe a little less cuddly, if you will. So this is one of the unique aspects of infant physical development. Now let's talk about the different principles of growth that infants use, or not just infants, human beings. First of all, we have the cephalocaudal principle. This one actually comes from Greek and Latin roots, and cepha meaning head, caudal meaning tail. So this one literally means from head to tail. And in this type of growth, the growth is following a pattern that where the head and the upper body parts tend to develop first. Then the lower body parts are developing afterwards. So, for example, the visual abilities, the eyes, those are developing before coordination of arms and legs. So this is an example of the cephalocaudal principle. Next, we have the proximodistal principle. This one breaks into the roots for near, proximo, and far. So if you think about proximo like in proximity, okay? If you are in proximity to a certain restaurant, that means you're near to it. Distal, think distant. So near, far. Proximo, distal. In this type of growth, it's not the same as head to tail. It's not the upper body followed by the lower body. This principle of growth basically has development starting in the center, the torso, the trunk. The most important parts of human functioning are in that center area of the body. Okay, so that's the near part. That comes first. Then the extremities, the hands and the fingers, the feet and the toes, those, the ability to control those outward parts of the body comes much later than the systems in the center. Okay, so like digestion and, heartbeat, so the cardiovascular system, these things are going to develop more quickly than, for example, your ability to use your fingers to do something specific. Okay. Also in this proximodistal principle, we're looking at gross motor skills, so the larger muscle groups versus the fine motor skills, the smaller muscles. Like I said earlier, like being able to coordinate your fingers to maybe grasp something. That's going to come after your ability to move your whole arm. All right, now the last two, it's very easy to get these confused. You'll see why in just a second. The third one is the principle of hierarchical integration. Okay, hierarchy meaning importance. Okay, integration meaning combining. All right, so in this principle of growth, the simple skills develop separately and independently, but then later we combine them, we integrate those individual skills and use them to create a more complex skill. For example, you have the control of individual fingers before you can use the entire hand to grasp something more steadily, like a spoon. And they can only pick up large objects from 4 to 8 months. So in this time period, basically they're only using those kind of larger muscle groups, but then later they're able to fine tune, use their fine motor skills, and coordinate those to do more detailed behavior. All right, now the fourth one is the principle of the independence of systems. This one basically says, and the reason you might get this confused with the previous one is because they both use the term independent, but they use them at different times. The principle of the independence of systems says these different body systems may grow at different rates and have nothing to do with each other. For example, the nervous system is functioning well and comprehensively, basically everything that it needs to do by birth. Okay, so the brain and the spinal cord, these things are developed prenatally. But what about the sexual reproductive systems? Well, sexual maturation, as we know, or if you don't know, we will learn, doesn't occur until puberty, doesn't occur until adolescence. So this is an example of two different body systems in the same human being that are growing and developing completely independently of each other. Okay, so that's an example of the principle of the independence of systems. Okay, several times in this video, or this PowerPoint in particular, but many of the PowerPoints that you're going to come across in this class, I'm going to have you go to my development lab and look at several videos. In my face-to-face classes, this is what I do. These videos very often are complementing what we're talking about, and they really help the students digest what we're doing. So click on this video link. If it just takes you to the main My Development Lab page, go into the video series. It's one of those, what do you call it? One of the screens that's sliding from one side to the other, and then it changes, and that's how you get into the My Virtual Life part. One of those little slide shows, if you will, says video series, and you would just click on launch the same way you would to get into the My Virtual Lab. It's just a different screen, if you will. So go into the video series, and there's tons of them, and specifically look for infant fine motor development and the one on gross motor development. Watch those and then come back to this PowerPoint. Okay, you should recognize this one from Psych 150, if not some of your other classes. This is a picture of a neuron. This is kind of like a cartoon version of a neuron, specifically so we can see the details and pinpoint which part is actually which. So you see on the left, we have the cell body, also called the soma, which is the cell's life support center. And you can see that little circle in the middle of the soma, that's the nucleus. And then we've got the little branch-like arms stretching out from the soma, or the cell body. These are the dendrites. If you remember from Psych 150, these are like the little fingers that are grabbing those messages that are coming from another neuron. Okay, so then the information goes through the dendrites to the cell body, and then down that long stringy tube called an axon. The axon passes the messages away from the cell body to the other neurons or muscles or glands by going to the end of the axon, called the terminal buttons or the terminal branches or the axon terminals. I like axon terminal because that tells us exactly where it's located. At the end, terminal meaning end, at the end of the axon. Okay, and these are the little knobs or buttons at the end of the axon. Now, backing up just a hair, you can see the myelin sheath. That's the fatty covering over the axon that both protects the axon, but it also works as a conductor. It helps speed those neural impulses that are coming from the soma and going to the terminal buttons or axon terminals. And here are some neurons in action. And I say in action, but they're not actually moving. Especially if you took me for Psych 150, you probably remember us talking a lot about synaptic connections and how the neurons are connecting with each other when you learn something. So the creation of these synaptic connections indicate that the human being has been exposed to something and learning, or the physical changing of the brain, has now taken place. So you see the far left picture is a newborn. There's lots and lots of neurons, if you remember, between 100 and 200 billion, with a B, billion neurons, but there aren't very many connections. Okay, then you go to the very next picture, which is an infant at 1 month. Now they're starting to make a few connections. They still don't have many, but they have a few. 6 months, this is where the child is old enough to maybe sit up, they can smile, they can babble, they can laugh. They're really, really cute, but they're not walking or crawling usually by this point. And as you can see, they are interacting with their environment, and as a result, they are making lots more synaptic connections. The last picture on this slide is a child of 2 years old. So they're a toddler now. They're walking, running, falling, but they're learning tons of things. They probably have about a 50-word vocabulary at this point. And you can see those synaptic connections between these neurons. It's just like a little forest, okay? They're just these little connections all over the place. They're tangled. They're just exploding, okay? From your textbook, and I believe that this quote is specifically from the Development Across the Lifespan textbook. At birth, most neurons in an infant's brain have relatively few connections to other neurons. During the first 2 years of life, however, a baby's brain will establish billions of new connections between the neurons. Furthermore, the network of neurons becomes increasingly complex. The intricacy of neural connections continues to increase throughout life. So let's talk about synaptic pruning. Again, if you took Psych 150 with me, you might remember this. Synaptic pruning occurs somewhere between the ages of 6 or 7, and usually it's done by the age of 10 to 12. Okay, but this picture, this image, if you will, shows birth, where, remember, we don't have very many of those connections yet. Then at age 7, we've got that virtual forest where they've just learned and learned and learned and learned and learned, and their brain neuron activity has just exploded. They've got this virtual jungle, if you will. Then at 15, if you look at the picture of the 15 years of age, there aren't as many connections. Well, what happened? Did we get dumber between 7 and 15? No, we didn't. Everything's fine. What happened, I really like this. One of my former students mentioned this in our review. It was like, it's kind of like you're getting rid of the clutter. And I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. That's exactly what this is happening. It's not that that you're not learning more. You are. But as a teenager in adolescence, the pruning process is kind of getting rid of the extra stuff that you don't really need. That leaves room for what's there to get bigger and stronger and thicker. And it's kind of like if you've ever done any gardening or planting, especially like every summer, I help my mom plant a garden with like vegetables and flowers and stuff. And you can't plant hundreds of seeds in one little area. Why not? Well, because none of them will grow very big. There's too many in that area. Therefore, they're all going to be fighting over the nutrients, and they'll all end up dying probably because they're all going to be super, super small. None of them can get everything that they need to grow big and strong and actually produce whatever it is you're trying to get. It's the same way with our neurons, with our synaptic connections. The ones that are weak, the ones that we don't really do much with, we want those out of there. They're just taking up space. Okay, we need the space to go for the ones that we're using on a regular basis. The ones that we're strengthening, we want all of the nutrients and stuff to go to those so they can be big and strong. So synaptic pruning is the process by which all the extra neurons and synaptic connections that aren't being used are eliminated in order to increase the efficiency of the neuronal transmissions. This pruning causes the ones that are left, the synaptic connections that remain in the brain, it helps them to become stronger, more specialized. You can think more deeply with the neurons that you've been using than you could, for example, at 7 years old. All right, so here's another quote. Beginning in the earliest embryonic stage and lasting until approximately 2 years of age, new neurons and synapses are formed at an amazing rate, at times reaching 40,000 new synapses formed per second. Holy moly, that's a lot. By the end of this process, individuals are left with far more neurons and synapses than are functionally needed and or even preferred. Synaptic pruning is the process by which these extra synapses are eliminated, thereby increasing the efficiency of the whole neural network. The entire process continues up until approximately 10 years of age, by which time nearly 50% of the synapses present at 2 years of age have been eliminated. The pattern and timeline pruning follows may vary based on the brain region. Again, the process is intended to increase the efficiency of the neurological system. And if you think about it like this, if we didn't have synaptic pruning, we wouldn't be able to learn and process information as quickly and as deeply as we do by the time our brain is maturing, because we would still have a very shallow level of processing. And kids are very intelligent. There's absolutely no denying kids have amazing brains. They've got I almost call them spongy neurons. They can just soak up information very, very quickly, but they cannot interact with that information on a very deep level until after this synaptic pruning has taken place. So the potential of a child learning is huge and is not seen again, ever again in life. Okay, before synaptic pruning happens, their spongy neurons are almost miraculous. It's amazing. And that's why early childhood education is so important. Is it hard to watch kids play and teach them the ABCs? Well, for some people, but I mean, it's not terribly difficult, but it is so extremely important because they're never going to have this cognitive ability ever again. They're not going to be able to make these connections so quickly ever again in their lives. So we've got to expose them to this information. And, if you don't use it, you lose it. That's what happens with synaptic pruning. So we need to expose children in early childhood and infancy to many of these things, or else they will never have the capacity to pick that up. Speech is an example of that. Later in this lecture, we'll talk about a girl named Jeannie and how language development ties back in to synaptic connections and synaptic pruning. Right now, I'd like you to stop the lecture again and go to Blackboard if you're at PCC or Moodle if you're at Van Scramble and read this article, The Brain of a Child by Daniel Golden. It's really short, but it's really fascinating. And it talks about these synaptic connections and the synaptic pruning process. So brain plasticity. If you remember from Psych 150, we talked about how it's the ability of the brain to grow and change. So plasticity is the degree to which a developing structure or behavior is modifiable or changeable due to experience. Now, plasticity continues all throughout your life. Plasticity is that making new synaptic connections, learning new things. And plasticity specifically focuses on that physical change that is happening in the brain when new connections have been made. So it continues throughout life until you are brain dead. You have the neurological capability of learning new things and making new synaptic connections. But, and this kind of ties back to the article you just read about children and the brain's plasticity is the absolute greatest in the first 2 years of life. Okay, more than at any other time, that is when the peak of plasticity really is. And even throughout early childhood, this is where that brain has this insurpassable ability to make these new connections much, much more quickly and with much less effort than someone who is older, specifically with adults. So here's the example that I give. An infant with a brain injury has a much better chance of full recovery or much greater rate of recovery than adults who have the same injuries. Well, why? Well, it's because the infant's brain is much more plastic, much more spongy and just waiting to make those synaptic connections. So if some part of the brain is damaged, other parts will jump in and start compensating for it. Adults, it's kind of like old Play-Doh. If you've ever played with old Play-Doh, I mean, it's not as soft, it's not as sticky, it may even be kind of dry and crunchy. That's kind of, not exactly, but that's an analogy for what adult neurons are. You can still mess with them, you can still do stuff, but not as easily and perfectly as when it's fresh Play-Doh straight out of the package for the very first time. So that's kind of a picture of how our neurons change over the lifespan. Again, I want you to pause this, and you can just click on this hyperlink, and it'll take you to YouTube and show you a short video on Jody Miller. If you were in my Psych 150 class, you've probably already seen this. And it talks about how her brain in particular was able to show so much plasticity because it happened when she was so very young. Then come back to the PowerPoint. All right, now let's talk about the 5 senses, specifically in newborns. This is pretty fascinating. First, we're going to talk about the visual preferences. What do newborns see when they're first born? Not many people know this, but newborns don't really like pastel colors, mainly because they can't really see them. Okay, we always do baby pink or baby blue, yet newborns don't care. That's for the adults. That's definitely not for the newborns. They tend to see lots of contrast. For example, if something is black and white, that's what shows up to them, not these pale pink, pale blue type things. They also tend to prefer faces over non-faces. They've done research studies where they would put all the facial features like the eyes, the mouth, nose, the ears, they would put them in these random orders on this face, if you will. And the newborns were not nearly as interested in all of these randomly placed features. But if they were placed in a facial configuration, they were just fascinated by it. And we're talking newborns. We're not even talking about several months old. We're talking about straight out of the oven. Okay? They also tend to prefer curved lines over straight. And if you look at someone's face, guess what? There's a lot of curved lines. All of these things are drawing the newborn's attention to people's faces, particularly their mother's face. They've shown that even within the first few hours of birth, the newborn has learned to prefer his or her mother's face over the faces of random people that are also coming into that newborn's field of vision. And up until about 3 months of age, 2 or 3 months, they cannot see very far. They're not able to focus. They'll see movement, they'll see shapes, but they won't be able to focus on the details except up to 10 inches. So if you, for just a second, act like you're holding a baby in your arms, okay? Imagine where that baby's face is, okay? Usually it's in the crook of your arm if that's how you're holding the baby. That infant's face is roughly 8 to 10 inches from yours. That's all they can focus on. So this actually shows us from birth, when a caregiver is feeding a newborn child, make eye contact, show facial expressions, because that's about as far as they can see, but they are already picking up information. They're exposed to outside stimuli, they're making new synaptic connections. Use that time to your advantage and help them grow cognitively. Help them to have something interesting to look at. Talk to them, even though they can't talk back yet. And maybe that's another reason you should talk to them, because they can't talk back yet. Ha! All right, now let's talk about the reflexes. Reflexes are the inborn physical skills that the infant is born with. They do not have to learn these. They are automatic. Okay, in your textbook, no matter which of the Feldman textbooks you're using, there is a chart in there. So be sure you look through the chapter and find that chart, because these reflexes, a lot of them actually form the foundation for future, more complex, and later they become voluntary behaviors and skills. So take a second, look at that chart in your textbook, and click on this hyperlink. Watch the video on infant reflexes. Some of these you may not have seen before, but they're pretty interesting. All right, now let's talk about cognitive development. If you remember Piaget from Psych 150, we're going to be talking about Piaget all throughout this course. And he specifically designed his theory centered around the cognitive development in the human being. Now, if you remember, his is a stage approach, not a ramp. His is more like the stair step, the discontinuous change that we were talking about in chapter 1. But even Piaget admitted that movement between the sensory motor stage and the preoperational stage is a little more gradual than the stair step analogy makes it seem. It's not quite as abrupt. Oh, at 1 year and 364 days, they couldn't, use symbols, but then the next day, bam, they got it. No, it's not like that. It's less abrupt, and it's much more gradual between sensory motor stage and preoperational, even though the stages themselves are very, very qualitatively different. And that actually leads into the next bullet point. Piaget emphasized a change in the quality of the child's knowledge and understanding, not just the quantity. Not, oh, you've learned more just in the same way. No, you actually are changing the way you are processing information, the way you're able to interact with that information. It changes qualitatively from stage to stage. All right, so let's talk about some of Piaget's concepts under his theory. First of all, he said that we learn things by developing schemes. These are mental structures that are the building blocks for how we understand the world. You can kind of think of schemes like a template, okay, or a skeleton. It basically just kind of gives us a basis, a starting point, if you will. And there's two different types of schemes that Piaget said that infants and toddlers use as they are gaining knowledge. The first one of these is assimilation. This is placing new information in an existing file folder. Okay, if you think about this like file folders, it really does work pretty well. Assimilation is when maybe you've got 4 file folders. Okay, you're an infant, you know food, you know animals, you know people, and you know everything else. So like, machines, houses, toys, all of that fits in that other else. Okay, so you've got 4 file folders. Well, now you come across a bear. Okay, you've never seen a bear before. Okay, but you look at your file folders. Okay, is it food? Well, no. Is it a human? No. Is it an animal? Yeah. Okay, stick it in that file folder. Okay, that's assimilation. Another example of this, you're just sticking it where it fits best. Okay, so a toddler might see a school bus and go, oh, car. Okay, they know that cars roll, okay, and hold people. They see a bus rolling and holding people. They're like, car. Okay, no, it's not a car, but it's just kind of sticking it into a file folder based on that person's current level of knowledge and understanding. That's assimilation. Now, accommodation is actually the next step up. This is where the person realizes, and this is where, we will enlarge the child's knowledge and understanding. We teach them how to create a new file folder for this new information that doesn't really fit best in the ones that the child already has. So instead of looking at the school bus and calling it a car, we will actually expand it and be like, well, it's a bus. It's big, it's long and yellow, like a car. And then they start to realize, oh, it's different. A bear is not a doggy. A bear is a different animal. It is a wild animal. See, that's accommodation, expanding the file folder or the informational storage by creating a new file folder for that new information. I hope that makes sense. I hope it didn't confuse you with where I went there. All right, now let's talk about the sensory motor stage. We talked about this in Psych 150, but now we're going to go more in depth. Instead of just talking about the stage at large, we're going to talk about the 6 substages and what happens in each of those. In substage 1, we have those simple reflexes that we talked about a little bit ago and in that video we watched. These are the ones that we're born with. We're not consciously or actively or voluntarily behaving or moving. Everything is reflexive. That's the first month of life, usually, okay? And as you would see in the chart, a lot of these reflexes die off in the first few months of life. Now, the second substage, this one is called first habits and primary circular reactions. The primary circular reactions and the first habits, generally those are limited to the infant's own body. Okay, like they're sucking on their own hand. They're moving their fingers in front of their eyes and they see them. Okay, these are first habits. These are primary circular reactions where the child is fascinated with their own body and they're starting to do things with their movement on purpose for the very first time. Okay, then they move into substage 3, which is secondary circular reactions. Here's what's different about this one. In primary circular reactions, it was usually their own body. Secondary, now it's not limited to their own body. Usually it has to do with objects in the outside world. Anything around them, now they're starting to interact with that and do things on purpose, like push something to make it swing, hit a button to make a noise. These are secondary circular reactions. And this is where they first are doing the actions that bring about desired consequences. They're not accidental movements. Now, I want this to happen, so I am doing this action. Substage 4, this is coordination of those secondary circular reactions. So now what they're doing, they're acting on their outside world, but they're able to put these different activities together to reach a goal. For example, in this one, there's one object partially hidden under another object. Well, now they can move that first object out of the way so they can get the one that's hidden underneath. Okay, that's two-step processing happening. That's huge. If you think about that, just a couple months earlier, they were reacting only on simple reflex, and now they're able to make a plan to get something. That's goal-directed behavior. That's problem solving, and those are huge cognitive strides. Okay, now at this point, you may have made this connection on your own, but this is where object permanence actually shows up. I think on the next slide is where I give you the definition of object permanence, but that's, if you remember, that's where they realize things exist even though they may no longer be in sight. Okay, so the object permanence usually happens around 8 or 9 months. Here's the definition: the understanding that an object still exists, even if it's removed from your sight. The example I give in my classes, because it really is a perfect example of this, peekaboo. Absolutely an infant's favorite game in the first few months of life, and they just think it's amazing. One of the reasons they think it's so amazing is because when you go behind your hands, they don't know that you're still there. They think you just kind of cease to exist. And then all of a sudden, you move your hands, bam, you're back. And they're absolutely blown away. And that's why they get so excited when you take your hands away from each other and all of a sudden there's your face. And it's like magic if they have not yet achieved object permanence. Now later, after they understand that you're still behind your hands, they're just wondering what in the world mom's doing. She just looks so silly. That's so funny. And then they just laugh at you. And it's still really cute and they're still really enjoying it, but it's a whole different reason for why they're enjoying it. Another example, I used to do this with my kids all the time, and it worked great until they achieved object permanence. They all wanted to play with my cell phone, so I would just put it under a piece of paper. And as soon as I put it under the piece of paper, they didn't think it existed anymore, and they'd stop going for it. But then, of course, when they're about 9 months old, they realize, oh, mom just put a piece of paper on top of the cell phone. And so they just move the piece of paper and grab the cell phone and stick it in their mouth. That is object permanence. We got it. We understand it. And that's a huge cognitive development as well. Okay, now I want you to go back into the My Development Lab video series, and I want you to watch the video Object Permanence Across Cultures. You'll see some examples of how object permanence is playing out. All right, now we've got substage 5, tertiary circular reactions. This one is roughly 12 months to 18 months, and this is where they start experimenting. Okay, they're able to do the goal-directed behavior from the last substage, but now they're doing the goal-directed behavior and they're changing things a little bit just to see what happens. Okay, if you've ever watched a kid throw their sippy cup off of their high chair or drop something out of the crib, and they'll do it again and again. They may throw it in a different angle. They may drop it on a different type of floor. They may, throw it in a different direction altogether. These are mini experiments. They're deliberately varying what they do and how they do it to see what the consequences will be, just to see what will happen. And this, again, it's a huge cognitive step. Then we've got substage 6, the beginnings of thought. This is where between 1.5 years old to 2 years, they become capable of mental representation. They can actually hold a picture of an event or an object or a person. They can hold that picture in their minds. And so they couldn't really do that before. Now they can imagine, where does daddy go when he goes to work? This is what mom did when she got on the computer. And this mental representation really is setting them up for their next stage, where they become capable of imaginary play. And they use deferred imitation, where they can actually mimic usually mom or dad or an older sibling or whoever they have access to that they're watching live life. They remember, they hold that picture of what that person did. They're holding that in their minds, and then they act just like it. They are imitating that individual later. Okay, now I want you to stop and watch this video. This one will show you each of the substages and how they differ from each other, and I think it's going to help you cement what's happening in each substage. I think it's going to really help you get those in your mind a lot better by watching this video. All right, now we're going to look at the information processing approach to cognitive development. We are not talking about Piaget and his theory anymore. Now we're talking about information processing. Now, If you took me for Psych 150, you've already seen these steps because they're the same ones involved in memory. Okay, and that makes sense. How we remember things is based on how we process that information. So we use encoding, which is the initial recording of that information. This is where we're very selective. We choose what is important, what we're going to pay attention to. That's the encoding process. Well, then we've got the storage step. This is where we find somewhere to put it. We save that information for future use. And then the retrieval, exactly what it sounds like. We are retrieving that information. We are pulling that information back out of storage. We are recovering it so we can use it. And only when all three of these are functioning correctly can we really process information. And that's the only way that we can actually remember the information. Researchers generally believe that information is processed similarly throughout the lifespan, even though the kind of information being processed changes and different parts of the brain may be used. People, regardless of their age, gradually lose memories, although, just like babies, they may regain them if reminders are provided. Moreover, the more times a memory is retrieved, the more enduring that memory becomes. In other words, we tend to use our brains in similar ways throughout our lives, but we do tend to lose memories. Even as infants, we lose the majority of the memories within our first 3 years of life. The more we retrieve a memory, the more we pull one out of our memory and replay it in our minds or talk about it, we're going to remember it better and better and better. It's more enduring at that point. So just think about it for a second. What is your earliest memory? Think about as much detail as you can, and then try to describe it. Where were you? How old were you? Who was with you? What was going on? One of the earliest ones that I remember is my 4-year-old birthday. And I remember that my mom made me a white cat birthday cake with M&M buttons. And nose and whiskers and eyes, all of those were M&Ms. And this was back before they had like the blue and red M&Ms. They were mostly like brown and yellow and orange and tan. Does anyone remember the tan M&Ms? I promise I'm not making that up. But that's my earliest memory, way back. And so I don't remember anything particular that happened before my 4th birthday. That's called infantile amnesia. And this is very, very common. In fact, it's very uncommon for someone to have a legitimate memory from their first 3 years of life, because generally those are very difficult to retrieve. And if we do retrieve them, they may or may not be accurate. Because as you know, memories are very corruptible. They're tricky. They can be altered. Any new information that comes in, our brain will reshape the memory to accommodate this new incoming information, and it can actually corrupt where the memory is no longer accurate. That's very, very common. All right, there's 3 basic views on how humans develop language. We're not talking about information processing, even though there is going to be some overlap. Now we're specifically looking at how humans learn to speak, okay, and how they learn to understand language. These 3 approaches are very, very different, kind of like the nature versus nurture debate. And I'm going to show you exactly where each of these language learning approaches falls on the nature versus nurture spectrum. So we've got the learning theory approach, we've got the nativist approach, and we've got the interactionist approaches. First, we've got the learning theory approach. If you remember from Psych 150, the learning theory is behaviorism. Okay, behaviorism is also known as learning theory. That's what's going on in this approach to language development. This theory says that you acquire language by using the basic laws of reinforcement and conditioning. You are conditioned to learn language. Okay, so here's an example. A baby says, Dada, and mommy and daddy get all excited and they're like, oh, did you hear that? He said, Dada. And they show extra attention and they show all of this enthusiasm, and the baby likes that. The baby's like, wow, this is pretty awesome. I made them pretty happy. I may do it again and make them happy again. Okay, that's being reinforced by mom and dad and grandma and whoever's around, by their excitement and attention. That's very reinforcing to the child, and so the child will probably say those sounds again and try to get that same response. That's behaviorism, plain and simple. That's operant conditioning right there. Okay, so that is how learning theory approach discusses, or what's the word I'm looking for? How they say that people acquire language. Next, we've got the nativist approach. This one is, if you remember, there was an article I had you read in Psych 150, and it talked about the nativists are all the way on the nature end of the spectrum, and then the empiricists were on the nurture end of the spectrum. So that's where this one comes from. The nativist approach says it's all nature. Okay, so this is the theory that a genetically determined innate mechanism directs language development. In other words, you are genetically designed to learn language. So there was a theorist called Noam Chomsky, and he specifically believed that humans were biologically programmed to learn language, and he said that we have something called the language acquisition device, or the LAD. He said this is the neural system of the brain that automatically, genetically allows us to understand language and then later recreate it. Basically, he also said that there was something called universal grammar, which is the fact that all of the world's languages, no matter how different they are, they have a similar underlying structure or skeleton. They all have subjects, they all have verbs, they all have objects. They may be in different orders, but this universal grammar, it's the similarities across all languages. Therefore, this language acquisition device allows us to understand any of them depending on which one is activated, if you will. And then we've got the interactionist approaches. This one is middle of the road. Okay, so if you have nature on one end of the spectrum and nurture on the other, interactionist is right in between the two, because this one says that language is acquired through both. Yes, genetic circumstances, this genetic predisposition to learn language, but that has to be combined with the environmental influences, the outside world interacting on us. So a lot of students, especially in my online classes, they look at interactionist and they say, oh, interactionist, we have to interact with other people to learn language. Nope. That's the learning theory approach, okay? Interactionist means the interaction between nature and nurture, okay? So the interaction between genetic and environment, that interaction is what helps us to learn language. Okay, so it's kind of like the peacemaker between the two, kind of like an all of the above. It's both. Biology and environment both have a part to play in language development, and both nature and nurture have to interact with each other for humans to develop language. Now, this is where I want you to stop again, go back to the My Development Lab video series, and you're going to watch this video on language development. Okay, then when you finish that, come back to this PowerPoint and we'll pick up. All right, you should have watched that video now. Now we get to talk about one of my favorite topics in all of developmental psychology, the critical period. Now, we mentioned this in chapter 1, and the critical period is a specific time during development when a particular event has its greatest consequences, and the presence of certain kinds of environmental stimuli is necessary for the development to proceed normally. Now, what does that mean? I'm so glad you asked. Basically, there's a certain period of time, and if the child is not exposed to language, for example, if a child is not exposed to language in general within this critical period, they will never learn language. Okay, that's what a critical period is. So the language was just an example. Now we're talking about a first language. If during the first maybe 4 years of life, a child is not exposed to a first language, they will never fully develop language in their lives. If you remember back when we talked about those neurons, they have this spongy neuron capability of making all these synaptic connections almost effortlessly. Okay, that's in the first few years of life. They have got to be exposed to a first language during this time. If they are not exposed to a first language during the first few years of life, they will not recover. Why? Because of synaptic pruning. If they don't make these connections in the left hemisphere, okay, if you remember from Psych 150, the left hemisphere is responsible for language and linear thought. So if those neurons in the left hemisphere are not activated, okay, or exercised, then they're going to die. And if they die, they will not come back. If that happens, the right hemisphere is going to try to compensate for that. The right hemisphere does not process information in the same way. The right hemisphere is going to try to pick up and learn language, but because it processes it differently, the grasp of language is going to be very incomplete. Okay? Now, I want you to read, there's 2 things I want you to do. You're going to read the article, The Civilizing of Genie. It's very, very fascinating. Okay, should be under your semester resources module. And then you're going to watch this video. I've got the hyperlink in the PowerPoint. Jeannie, that's not her real name, but she is a perfect case in point for the idea of language development, the different approaches to language development, and the whole idea of synaptic connections and synaptic pruning. So watch this video, read the article. You're going to need to understand both of these before you do your Genie written assignment. So don't skip any of it, or you're going to end up not getting the grade you want on that assignment.